War and human conflict. Questions are often asked about how this work regards war, and most people, when asked, would say they desire world peace, the universal brotherhood of man, and so on, asking, what is war? Why should there be conflicts? Or say, does God will war? And if God encourages wars, then can he be a god? In fact, many people who have some magnetic center, some power of seeing differences in the quality of things, some power of spiritual thinking rather than physical thinking, become overwhelmed by the increasing horrors of warfare. P.D. Ouspensky was asked at the beginning of the Second World War why it happened, what was the reason for the turn of events. He answered, "All of you in this work must try to understand why war exists." Ouspensky constantly taught that the most powerful force that we can create in ourselves is understanding. Saying that, this work gives us knowledge about our situation upon this earth, and its understanding means to understand the knowledge that we are given about our situation on this planet. However, most people think that understanding can be gathered simply from their ordinary knowledge, not realizing that in order to understand, new knowledge is necessary. That this new knowledge must combine with our being, in order to create fresh understanding. The first thing that is said in this regard is that the will of the Absolute does not reach this earth directly. If you like, we can call the Absolute God in the supreme sense, however, this work does not use that term. The ray of creation explains how the will of the Absolute or Supreme God passes downward through successive stages of creation, following the action of the law of three, a law of three forces, continually reduplicating itself. On this planet Earth of ours, in terms of the particular ray of creation to which we belong, we are under 48 orders of laws. The will of the Absolute, according to this teaching, can only reach us in the form of 48 orders of laws. In other words, the will of the Absolute cannot be experienced by us directly. It has been said that if the will of the Absolute intervened, the direct result would be that the whole of creation would be smashed and destroyed. P.D. Ouspensky, explaining this, said, "It is like a card game. If you alter the rules of the card game, then there is in practice no game any longer." This is the central idea that one needs to start from, in thinking about why war and all of its horrors exist on this planet, where we find ourselves very low down in the scheme of creation. Here we must remember too that the work strives to teach us that we must try to put ourselves under the laws that operate from higher levels in the ray of creation. That is the first point. The second point is that the work teaches that all war is caused by extraterrestrial forces, coming most immediately from the movements of the planets in our solar system. P.D. Ouspensky asked Gurdjieff what the cause of war might be, and Gurdjieff replied, "It is something like this. Two planets approach one another rather closely, a bit like someone unfamiliar appearing in our personal space where a tension is produced. This reflects itself upon the Earth, and may go on for many years in terms of human timelines. We experience something similar on a smaller scale when approaching a stranger. Some people may attract us and some repel us. We feel either drawn toward or repulsed by them. The hair behind our neck stands up, or we get goosebumps. Time is different on different scales, so planetary time may be just momentary to the planets, but appear to be a long time to humanity on the Earth, on our scale." Ouspensky then asked Gurdjieff how man could prevent these extraterrestrial tensions from acting on us in the way that they do. Gurdjieff's response was that these tensions affect man because humanity is, as yet, undeveloped, and not yet fully conscious. If humans were conscious, these tensions would produce quite different results. Instead of producing a destructive course of events, they would produce some quite different response. We would be drawn by compassion to the beggar on the street, instead of drawing back in revulsion, avoiding their gaze. What would be the result of an increased tension between planets, if it were more consciously taken? That inner tension, whether it be due to planets or higher cosmic forces occurring on the level of the Sun, would act upon mankind, working more consciously by increasing our consciousness, making us more awake, more aware, instead of the case today, where we fall deeper into sleep, becoming more violent, and even destructive. It would increase our cosmic consciousness, our awareness of galactic interplay, and of all the forces therein. The objectives within this work are to make it possible for our ordinary centers to receive such influences from higher centers in the correct manner. However, such as we are now, undeveloped, if we were to receive force directly from higher centers, it would be comparable to being struck by lightning, receiving millions of volts in an instant, and we would either lose our minds, become consumed with rage and grow violent, or have epileptic fits, degenerating into something 1,000 times more negative, more filled with hatred and the desire to destroy, which is the allegory of Kali. Legends and myths, or fables, are filled with narratives of such encounters. Because we are asleep, the work teaches that we cannot receive force for our awakening, unless we work on ourselves and prepare for a considerable period of time, thus preventing any increase of force that trickles down to us from turning negative and rendering anyone psychotic. We all know what happens to us emotionally if someone was to pop a paper bag next to our head when we are in deep sleep. All esoteric teaching is about the preparation of lower centers, then working on them within us for the reception of influence from higher centers, from higher up the ray of creation. The third point is that although we are all part of organic life on the surface of this earth, created through great nature in order to give a transmitting shock between the notes Fa and Mi of the ray of creation, which can then pass influences down from higher parts of the ray to its terminal buds, that are the moons. It no longer becomes necessary for us at this stage of our development to serve under that slavery. Gurdjieff pointed out that just at this juncture it becomes possible for mankind to no longer be entrapped in servitude. The pain factory of Earth known as organic life, whose turmoil nourishes the lower parts of the ray, including our moon, which are gradually developing on a planetary timescale. He pointed out that if only we could become more conscious that servitude might end. However, owing to the habits and practice formed through centuries of conditioning, habits of feeling, habits of thinking, attitudes and morality passed down through our cultures from parent to child, it appears that we shall continue to serve a purpose that is for us no longer necessary. The problem is, he observed, that we have all reached a stage in which we can become more conscious, and if we did so, then everything would change. However, because of traditions, prejudices, culture and religion, and because, in short, of our mechanicalness, we fail to reach this point. Therefore, backsliding begins, and we slip downhill, just at the very moment in which we might give ourselves a shock and pass into some new world order. Asked whether political developments of totalitarianism, made in the 19th century, were a step in the right direction, he answered no, quite the opposite in fact. We are simply putting ourselves into more and more servitude through these collective movements. The development of consciousness is an individual development, not group therapy. And, as pointed out frequently, when war comes along, people throw away even the small vestiges of consciousness that they normally possess. In fact, becoming quite irrational, and hence not seeing this insanity. Consciousness is weighed and measured, but there is only just a certain quantity of it. There is enough of this force of consciousness to change everything upon the earth, if people would but use it. Asked what he thought about the future, Gurdjieff said that people are sliding in the direction of decreased consciousness and mechanical servitude, forming either colonies of bees or colonies of ants that are ruled by hive mind through chemical romance. He said on occasion that we give ourselves in this regard a choice: would you be bees or would you be ants? The fourth point is that humankind is at a certain place in the octave of its own development, between the notes Mi and Fa. Ouspensky suggested we might think of this in the following order. Starting in the ascending octave from Do, he said, we might regard a single individual as Do, a family group as Re, and a nation as the note Mi. As we know, between the notes Mi and Fa it is necessary for a shock to be given. However, all of our ordinary lives consist of broken octaves of the order of Do, Re, Mi, where over and over again the same old song is looped. Ouspensky continued, to get to the note Fa, with regard to mankind, we must retain our individual feeling at the note Do, our family and responsibilities feeling at the note Re, our feeling of nationalism at the note Mi, and must pass to a new feeling at the note Fa, in which we can feel the existence of other nations, He noted that the right creation of international feeling at the note fa will always depend upon the three previous notes being sounded first, in other words, do, re, mi, and finally, fa. Any artificial attempts at sounding the note fa, which we might call international consciousness or regional awareness, are being made at the expense of the notes do, re, mi, at the expense of the individual, their family, and their community. Which means that people are being asked to be entirely collective and sacrifice their individuality for collective organization. We throw away even the consciousness to which we have a birthright when we unite in enormous masses, as in revolutions and wars or political movements. This is collectivism. We must isolate ourselves from those collective forces inwardly, before we can even hope to feel the magical touch of individuality awaiting us at some higher level. Although we have to isolate ourselves inwardly, we have to play our collective part as good householder, as laymen and laywomen, without identifying with it. Recall the definition of a good householder given previously in these commentaries: as a person who, whether man or woman, does their duty and feels responsibility with regard to life, but does not believe, or does not cling to the subjectivity of that life. This does not mean that a good householder believes in anything else. The integrity of the world at present and in the future depends upon the number of good householders that exist in every nation. There are, of course, theories to the effect that humanity is made for the Sabbath. The last great war really was between those who thought that we are made for the Sabbath, and those who thought that the Sabbath was made for man. This is the real analysis of that global conflict. Ants and bees think that individuals are made for the Sabbath, for the good of the hive or state, and you can see what happened to them through time. This situation was set into play 2,000 years ago, in that form of esotericism which is transmitted through the Gospels by the teaching of a conscious man, who said, when he healed an individual with a withered hand on the Sabbath, and was accused for so doing, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. A hand represents the power of doing in parables, and to have a withered hand is to have no power of individual action. Is there perhaps some deeper connection to be shared here? If the view that man is made for the Sabbath holds ground, then everyone's hand will become withered. If we sound the note fa incorrectly, then we have a situation in which individuals are called upon to sacrifice everything, for the sake of a world of internationalism, for regional unification, and for some greater good. All development of consciousness should take place through definite stages, each of which must remain as a note, sounding in the individual development of spirit. Any attempt to increase consciousness through forums such as international organizations will only make us more and more collective, less and less individual. It would be true to say that patriotism is not enough. However, if internationalism does away entirely with patriotism, then we obtain the wrong octave. Consciousness does not develop in the right way, and we backslide in the direction of bees or ants again, who have given up all sense of individuality, becoming simply state insects, lacking consciousness, hating other ant heaps or hives as they compete for resources. We can represent this octave as illustrated herein, where each note must depend upon the strength of the sounding in its lower note. For example, unless do, which is the individual person, sounds strongly enough, then society will lose all individuality in the resonance of the note mi, which is the state. What we are fighting for really is not expressed by the words freedom or democracy, but in the sounding of the different notes do, re, mi, in their right harmony as it were, with the possibility of sounding the note fa through regional consciousness and feeling, without loss of integrity in the other three notes. The fifth idea of this work is that we are all created as self-developing organisms, so we can reach a higher level of being through right knowledge and work. What in Buddhist teaching is referred to as right mindfulness and right action. This perhaps is the most central idea of all, because we are inferior to ourselves such as we are, asleep in this world, serving nature and the necessities of the great ray, which uses us as part of organic life for its own purposes. Here one needs reflect upon the origin of organic life, as a side octave from the level of the sun. Humankind asleep. Mechanical humanity are used as a mechanism. However, we are created not to be so used, but only if we make the individual effort to awaken. separating ourselves from personality. But we must be helped in this by esoteric teaching. All this part requires long and deep reflection over an extended period of time. If essence could remember, then war would cease. When essence is reborn through recurrence, it chooses the same situation, the same part in time, and everything reverts to the same as it was before, if it has not grown. All development in the work sense is the development of essence, and this always remembers. Of course, collective war can scarcely make people remember, because collective war is a manifestation of personality. State war is obviously a manifestation of collective personality. However, some people in their war experiences may remember. All people who are killed in any war are being born again in the past, where some may remember the next time. This means that in recurrence people might remember and so change the future, that when they arrive in 1938, they will remember. But if they have fought spuriously, if they have never deeply thought about what they are doing and understood it, then they will do the same thing all over again. All progress in humanity depends upon those who remember, those who, recurring again to the past, remember what happened before, in the future.